Let's recap what we've learned so far about arrays and discuss some of the common errors that occur when using them. An array is a data structure that allows us to store multiple values of the same type in a single variable. The default values of numeric array elements are set to 0. Arrays are 0 indexed, so an array with n elements is indexed from 0 to n minus 1. For example, 10 elements would have the index range from 0 through 9. If we try to access an index that is out of range, Java will give us an array index out of bounds exception, which indicates that the index is out of range, in other words, out of bounds. We're trying to access an element that is outside of what we've defined. To access array elements, we use square braces. This is also known as the array access operator. Here I'm showing an example of how to create an array. I'm using square brackets after the type. In this case, it's an int array, so I've got int, square brackets, then the name of the variable. I'm calling it simply array, so it's int, square brackets, array. Then after the equal sign, I type new int again, because it's an int array, and 5 in square brackets, representing the number of elements in the array. In other words, 5 is the length of the array. This array contains the elements from array 0 through array 4. It has 5 elements and an index range, in this example from 0 to 4. The new keyword is used to create the array and initialize the array elements to their default values. In this example, all the array elements will default to 0 because it is an int array. For Boolean arrays, elements would be initialized to false. If you use string or other objects, they would be set to a null reference. We can also initialize an array in line using an array initializer block as shown here. In this example, I've got int left to right square brackets, my numbers equals, and I've got left and right curly braces with the numbers 5 down to 1. Notice that I define the values for the array in curly braces in the order I want them assigned, each value separated by a comma. Alright, here's another example of our array. Hopefully you will recall that when I first used variables, I said a variable is a place in memory. Think of it like a box, and you can store something in that box. Well, the same goes for arrays. With arrays, you can imagine an array as a row of boxes or slots, where each box can contain a value. In other words, we could store something in each box. In this example, I've created an array with 5 elements. In other words, 5 boxes, and they are by default all initialized to 0. Every box in this example contains an integer value of 0. Every box or slot's got an index, which we can use to access the values by that index using square brackets. In this example, I've initialized the array with values in the same line using an array initializer, as I have talked about previously. Each box or slot contains a different value in this case. The array again has 5 elements, but I'm putting a different value into each box. The box or element at index 0 contains the number 10, the box at array element 1 contains 35, and so on. Alright, let's see some of the common errors that occur when working with arrays. Here's an example of the first common error, array index out of bounds. As you can see, I'm trying to assign the element at index 5, and that index doesn't exist, in other words, it's out of bounds. And the same goes if I use a negative index because arrays can't have a negative index. The index or position of the element has to be 0 or higher, but note that an array element's value can be a negative value. In other words, I can put a negative number into one of those boxes, but I can't try and access a specific box or element using a negative number. In this particular case, you can see that I've defined the array on the first line, int array, my array equals, then I've got the left and right curly braces with the following numbers in between, 10, 35, 20, 17 and 18, separated by commas. That's a 5-element array, but remember that our array index starts at index 0. Therefore, this code with my array, square brackets, and 5 in between, trying to set that to 55 is giving me an error. And you can see there on the screen in the bottom right-hand corner, in that scenario, I'm trying to basically update a box that doesn't exist in this particular array. So be careful when accessing array elements. Remember that array index positions start from 0 and go up to the length of the array minus 1. In other words, here I've got 5 elements, and the valid range to access those elements is from 0 to 4. A second common error happens when you loop through an array using the traditional for loop with an index variable. This one is a logic error because I'm starting here from element 1. Remember that the array index starts at 0. If I printed out the elements of this array, starting from index 1, the first element, which is at index 0, won't be printed in this scenario. If this ever happens to you, just change the variable in the for loop to start at 0. You can see what's happened in this code. I've assigned the values in the array to 10, 35, 20, 17 and 18, but the output, as you can see, has bypassed the value of 10 because that's the value from index 0 in the array. This is because the for loop, as you can see in the red box, started from the value 1, and of course index position 1 is really the second element and contains the value of 35. The last common error that happens would again cause an array index out of bounds exception. Now this is because the condition in the for loop isn't correct. Here I'm using the less than equal operator. You can see that highlighted in the red box. But I should be using just the less than operator. The problem happens because in the last iteration of the loop, the I variable will have the value 5 and the length of this array is 5. I've got 5 elements in the array, but the index range is from 0 to 4. When I is equal to 5, the condition will still be true because I've used the less than equal operator there. And the expression 5 is less than or equal to 5 is true there, with 5 being the value of I and 5 being the length of the array. This will cause another out of range exception. I know I'm repeating myself here, but it's important to remember that the index starts at 0 and ends at 1 less than the length of the array. This type of error caused me a lot of problems when I was learning to program. When looping, it's easier to use the less than sign than having to use the length minus 1. Here you can see that I could change the code to I less than my array.length, which would work just fine. If you're just printing out an element like the code is doing here, then the enhanced for loop is probably a better option because it's less error prone. Use the enhanced for loop if you're looping through elements from first to last and you want to process them one at a time and you're not setting or assigning values to elements. Alright, so that's a recap of arrays. I hope you got a lot out of it, and we'll move on now to the next video.